Tommy Lister, also known as Tiny Lister, who played Zeus in the movie No Holds Barred opposite Hulk Hogan and feuded with Hogan on WWE television to help promote the movie, was found dead in his home on Thursday at the age of 62 of what authorities say seems to be natural causes, but his manager, Cindy Cowan, said he had gotten sick about a week ago. He couldn't breathe. He felt weak. And she thinks it may have been COVID. He apparently tested positive for COVID earlier this year and he beat it. But she seems to think that he either got it again or it had to do with his earlier diagnosis. We'll know soon enough, I guess, if more information comes out. But very sad to hear that. He had a very unique look as Zeus with that giant Z carved out in the side of his head and that eye. Yeah, he was born blind in his right eye. So I remember watching when I was a kid. I'm like, why does his eye look like that? I didn't know at the time that he was born, blind in the eye. But that is how it came to look like that. No Holds Barred may be what wrestling fans most remember him for, but a lot more people know him from his role as Deebo in the Friday movies. He was in the Fifth. He's been in a lot of movies. He was in The Fifth Element. Jackie Brown was another one that I remember him being in. He was in one of the Austin Powers sequels, or maybe there was only one sequel. How many sequels were there to Austin Powers? I know of one. I don't know, maybe they had more than that, but he was in one of those movies. And The Dark Knight, which is probably one of my, not probably, it is one of my top 3 favorite films of all time. And he had a role in that movie as well. A pretty important role, too. It was a small part, but it was a pretty important part of the movie. But his career is just, you can see his career just peppered with a lot of small roles and bit parts, but it just feels like he's been in so many different things. It's very impressive when you look at his filmography to see how many movies, not only that he was in, but even up until the day that he passed away, he's got something like half a dozen or a dozen different films that are still in pre-production. So he was working right up until the day of his death. For me, as a young Hulkamaniac, it was No Holds Barred, and Zeus scared the shit out of me. He legitimately scared me in the movie when he ripped that chunk of hair out of Stan Hansen's head in that barroom fight scene. And every time he would come on screen, the first time he popped up on screen and the menacing music in the background, it scared me, when I watched that movie. Yeah, I don't know if he killed Stan Hansen in that scene or not, or he just ripped the hair out of his head. They certainly played it up like he was just dead. But they did a tremendous job of building this guy up as a villain. He played a convicted killer, just out of prison. Had that movie really taken off, I feel like today, with all of the sequels and the prequels and everything we see in the movies today, if this had been a bigger deal, and maybe this had come out in more recent times, I feel like today Zeus's backstory would be enough to warrant a prequel, just to explore the backstory of how Zeus came to be Zeus. They do a lot of that these days, a lot of origin stories. I think that could have worked. I think that could have been interesting. But if you've never seen the movie, Vince McMahon personally financed the entire thing. It was a vehicle designed to promote Hulk Hogan as the next big movie star, the next big action star. He was going to be the next Arnold Schwarzenegger or Sylvester Stallone. That was, I'm sure, kind of what they had in their heads. Randy Savage got the WWF title at WrestleMania 4 so that Hogan can go off and film No Holds Barred. And so in the movie, Hogan plays a wrestler named Rip, who did this weird gesture with his hand, and he would go, "Rip him." Whoo! That was kind of his thing. He called himself Rip, but he was the WWF champion. And I always thought it was very silly that he wouldn't play himself in the movie, especially since you had Mean Gene Okerlund under that name and Jesse the Body Ventura under that name. And I just thought it was strange. Now, maybe it had something to do with Marvel Comics, and they couldn't use the Hulk name in the movie. That's possible. But basically the story, the top executive for a rival television network wants Rip to come work for him. And when he refuses, Mr. Brell, which is his name in the movie, Brell creates this underground fight competition called the Battle of the Tough Guys. This was basically Raw Underground before Raw Underground was a thing. You know, if they wanted Raw Underground to be a success, they should have brought back Kurt Fuller to reprise his role as Brel. Forget the fact that he was electrocuted at the end of the movie. We can forget about that. Right? I mean, the Dan Connor died at the end of Roseanne. They brought him back on the Connors. So sometimes you could just retcon that stuff, right? Let's pretend he didn't die at the end of the movie. You get Kurt Fuller to reprise his role as Brel. Bring back Brel. Brel could be like what Dario Cueto was on Lucha Underground. You bring him back, you bring back Zeus to beat the fuck out of Dolph Ziggler on Raw Underground. I would have tuned in to see that. I would not have skipped over those segments if they would have done that. But Brel in the movie, for some reason, had this very unhealthy obsession throughout the entire film of calling people jockasses. They weren't jackasses, they were jockasses. I still use that insult to this day, here and there. I never forgot that. I just thought it was such a unique way to insult somebody. I'd never heard that before, and I haven't heard that since. Jockass. I've heard of jock itch. I'd never heard of jockass before. Maybe that's a different kind of jock itch. But it all builds to the final showdown between Rip and Zeus, and Hogan don't job, so you know how it ends. I'm not going to tell you that it's a great movie, because it's not. You can tell Vince McMahon came up with the script, or had a lot of influence in the script, because it has a lot of toilet humor, and just the kind of humor that I'm sure would pop Vince McMahon. But I enjoyed it for what it was. I mean, I know Roger Ebert called it a disgusting film. He ranked it among the worst movies of the year. What did that guy know, though, right? It got a 10% fresh rating on Rotten Tomatoes. Audiences seem to like it a little bit more. They gave it 34%. No Holds Barred is the definition of a guilty pleasure for me. I bought the DVD a few years ago when they finally released it on DVD. And it needs to be said, it was genius for Vince McMahon to use a Hogan-Zeus feud on television as a way to try to sell the movie. Now, he had of course, he had the greatest interest in wanting the movie to be a success because he financed it. So if he didn't at least break even, he would have lost his money. And when your money is on the line, it's amazing the lengths that you will go to make sure that it is a success. But it was actually very brilliant. Yeah, from a marketing perspective, it was brilliant on his part to use his own television shows as a means beyond just trailers and TV commercials. He could use his entire show. He can build an entire pay-per-view main event around the idea of promoting this film. When the movie came out, it was number 2 in its first week, behind one of the Indiana Jones movies. I think it made about $5 million in its first week. It was not anywhere close to the success that they were hoping it would be. I know there was an episode of Raw sometime late in '97 during the Monday Night War where Vince on commentary even joked. He took a dig at Hogan, saying that Hogan had promised to pay him his salary back or something if Vince didn't make his money back on the movie. So I guess the check is still in the mail. It was something like that. So it didn't do well. But the way that they used Zeus was, again, brilliant. They never put him in a singles match because that would have been just a complete disaster. So they paired him off with Randy Savage. So I can't think of a better dance partner to have than the Macho Man. They paired him off with Randy Savage and Sensational Sherry, and they kept him limited to tag team matches. The SummerSlam 89 main event is actually a really fun match, and it did big business. And then they used Zeus very, very briefly, but they used him in a Survivor Series match that year where he wouldn't stop choking out Hulk Hogan at the very beginning of the match, and so he was quickly disqualified. And that built to No Holds Barred, the match, the movie, which was this pay-per-view that they put together in December. It was Hogan and Beefcake Barber. That's what Zeus would call him on TV. He would never called him Brutus. He never called him Brutus Beefcake. He never called him Brutus the Barber. It was Beefcake Barber. That's what he called him. So it was Hogan and Beefcake Barber against Zeus and the Macho King at this pay-per-view. And, it was a match they taped weeks earlier at some TV taping, and then they just took the one match. It was a tag team match inside a steel cage. It took 3 leg drops, but Hogan, he pinned Zeus, and he vanquished the bad guys, and that was the end of Zeus in the WWF. The story has always been that Vince McMahon's original idea, the original thought that he was considering, and how serious it got, I don't know. But the original idea for WrestleMania 6 was to do Hogan one-on-one in the main event against Zeus and recreate the final match from the movie. Zeus himself claimed that Vince McMahon told him that he was going to put the belt on him and give him a run with the championship for a year. He said Hogan was going to get $2 million for the match at WrestleMania and he was going to get $500,000. And he says the deal had already been negotiated. Now, I don't know how much of that I believe, but I can believe that there was absolutely an idea to do the match at WrestleMania, and thank Christ it didn't happen. That would have been just a complete and total mess. Can you imagine Zeus as WWF champion for an entire year? I mean, I probably would take Zeus as the champion over the Great Khali, but the Great Khali was not the World Heavyweight Champion for a friggin' year. But imagine that, or imagine being screwed out of the Hogan Warrior main event for Hogan Zeus. But, for an actor who admitted that he didn't know a damn thing about pro wrestling before he got into it, and when the idea was initially floated to him, hey, what do you think about doing some wrestling on the shows to help promote the movie? His attitude at the time was, I'm not gay, I'm not going to touch these guys, and, he was all like that, until he found out how much money they were going to pay him, and then he's like, okay, what guy do I need to touch? It's amazing how money can change your mind on things very quickly. But yeah, he didn't know anything about wrestling. To him, it was a bunch of guys, just rolling around on the mat, and he didn't have any interest in doing that until he found out how much money he could make off it. But when he was, protected and limited the way he was in WWE, he was fine. He looked the part. He was very scary to look at. In that situation, he was fine. But he worked a match in Puerto Rico against Abdullah the Butcher in the summer of 1990 as Zeus. And he claims that the promoters there, it was like a big anniversary show in Puerto Rico, and I guess they wanted to have almost like this freak show kind of attraction. And he claims they offered him $22,000 to do the match. Just one match. But he had heard about, how things could be in Puerto Rico and how dangerous it could be, so he took 2 LA police officers along on the trip with him, I guess that he was friendly with, just to watch his back and make sure that nothing happened, because he was made aware of the whole Bruiser Brody thing, and he didn't trust that, something might not happen to him, and so he brought the 2 officers along with him. So if you have any doubts that a singles match at WrestleMania would have been among the worst WrestleMania main events of all time, go watch the match on YouTube between Zeus and Abdullah the Butcher. It is as bad as it sounds. It is not good. It is not passable. It is awful. It is dreadful. It is one of the worst matches that I have ever seen. But he ranked number 500 in the very first PWI 500 list in 1991, which is a mystery to me because the man wrestled 5 matches in his entire career, 3 of which were in 1989. And one very awful one in 1990. That was it. That was it. And yet he ranked, the fact that he ranked it all in 91 is just mystifying to me. The only other match that he worked was 5 years later. Hogan got him into WCW as part of the Alliance to End Hulkamania, because Hulk needed some big guys, some big villains to beat. That's what Hogan was all about, really, that whole 1995-96 period before, pre-NWO in WCW. It just felt like it was this one giant period of Hogan feuding with the Dungeon of Doom and getting jobs for guys like Kamala and Earthquake and all these people who he could just beat. Because Hogan was the big hero, and so he could beat the big guys. And so they had this thing, the Alliance to End Hulkamania. They brought in Zeus. I guess they couldn't call him Zeus. So they brought him in as Z Gangsta, Or as Tony Schiavone used to call him, Z-Gangster, because he's the whitest man in America. They brought him in to be part of this absolutely horrendous doomsday cage match at Uncensored 96, where Hulk Hogan and Randy Savage had to run the gauntlet. It was like this triple cage deal, years before WCW did the whole triple cage thing, and they had to run the gauntlet against... And I had to look up the team because I forgot all the names of the different members. I remembered Luger and Flair and then, Z-Gangsta. But it was Lex Luger, Ric Flair, Arn Anderson, The Barbarian, Kevin Sullivan, Meng, Z-Gangsta, and The Ultimate Solution, who was played by Jeep Swenson, which might be a name you've heard of before. Swenson used to be a wrestler. He was an actor. Stuntman, actor, he did that for a number of years. He was also in No Holds Barred. He actually played the role of Lug Wrench, who was one of the tough guys that Zeus beat or killed or something. So Hogan got his old movie buddies a couple of paydays, and of course the Mega Powers won, 8 against 2, and the Mega Powers won. Like John Cena and Randy Orton beating the entire Raw roster. Although I think that was 17-2, if I remember. So that was worse. But when WCW initially brought Jeep Swenson in, they called him the Final Solution. The Final Solution is what the Nazis called their plan to kill the Jews during the Holocaust. So that didn't go over very well. And they quickly changed his name to the Ultimate Solution. But I was reading an old Grantland article about Lister. And I was reading about some of the mortgage fraud stuff that he was accused of. He pled guilty to a mortgage fraud scheme a number of years ago. But they interviewed Hogan for this article. And they were just to talk about the Zeus stuff, not the mortgage stuff. And in that SummerSlam match in '89, Hogan and Beefcake had an expression that they would use. It was like their safe word for Zeus. I mean, I hate to put that image in your heads, but that's basically what it was. It was basically a safe word or a safe expression that they would use when Zeus got a little too rough with them in the ring, and that was free James Brown. James Brown at the time was behind bars. I don't remember for what, but he was in jail. And whenever they wanted to calm down Zeus, if they had, let's say he had them in a bear hug, which is one of the only moves he knew, right? A big guy. So what do? You pick the guy up, put him in a bear hug. If he was squeezing too tight, if he was just being too rough in the ring, or just was too amped up, their way of calming him down and trying to make him laugh or whatever, because he found it amusing, they would say, free James Brown. And then he would loosen up, and he would calm down a little bit. Hogan used it on the set of the movie, too. And one time he accidentally broke Zeus's nose, and he was worried because he didn't know what his reaction would be. He didn't know if this guy was going to beat the fuck out of him. And when he broke his nose, he said Zeus just looked at him, and he said, "I thought you loved me. What about James Brown?" But he will always have his place in wrestling history, and it was a very memorable character. It was a very memorable role. Again, maybe not the greatest movie in the world, but as somebody who was growing up at that time, fan of the product, and I very vividly remember all of the promotion for this movie. I thought they did a masterful job of building that character up and making him seem intimidating, and doing their best to hide and he had a lot of weaknesses, but doing their best to hide those weaknesses. And just use him for what he was really good at, which was just standing there and scaring the hell out of people like me. So I was very sorry to hear about his death this week.